This week's reading from Rays of the One Light by Swami Kriyananda is entitled, Does God Hide the Truth? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. In last week's reading, we saw that the great masters themselves counseled discretion in the dissemination of truth. The counter-argument is sometimes made, but the Lord doesn't hide. He reveals His beauty in the sunsets, His tender sympathy in the rain, His wrath in the thunder, His restless energy in the brooks, His power in the sunlight. There are exoteric truths, and there are also esoteric truths. Exoteric meaning generally understood, and esoteric meaning understood by a very few people, hidden truths. There is that which is revealed impersonally and left up to us to interpret, such as the thunder and our perception of it as divine wrath, the rain and our perception of it as God's sympathy. But behind even God's most open expressions, there lies impenetrable mystery. The wind blows where it wills, said Jesus in the Gospel of St. John. You hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it is going. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. And Sri Krishna says in the 9th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, By me the whole vast universe of things is spread abroad, by me the unmanifest. In me are all existences contained, not I in them. God's hidden reality cannot be understood by the reasoning faculty. India's Sankhya philosophy states frankly, Ishwar Ashiddha, God is not provable. A willingness to seek the underlying reality behind appearances is essential for those who would know God. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
The title today, Does God Hide the Truth? And on one hand, it might seem that way because His presence is not obvious. His presence is not, tangible. We can't hold on to His presence and say, okay, this therefore is God's presence. We just can't do that. It's so subtle, God's presence within. And I wanted to just read this last sentence of the reading. A willingness to seek the underlying reality behind appearances is essential for those who would know God. So, a willingness to seek the underlying reality behind appearances is essential for those who would know God. In a way, Swamiji hid that sentence in that whole reading because that's the essence, that's the core of how we can tune into the truth. It is hidden, but it's up to us to perceive it. It's just one of those wonderful mysteries of life that those who want to know God, those who want to love God, are able to more and more tune inward, more and more feel God's presence. And it's just such a joy to have that. Very often we tend to think, oh, that meditation wasn't very good because my thoughts were so busy and crazy today. And, what a bad meditation. I'm so worried about things and I could barely even sit. And, that's the reality we're aware of. The physical, what's happening outwardly. I'm sitting here, my mind is having all these thoughts. That's what we perceive on the outside. And then maybe over a little time in the meditation, we get more calm, we start to feel peace, that kind of a thing. But still, because we had the experience of those thoughts, we judge it. And we have to account for the fact that the mystery, even in meditation, is so deep that we are only perceiving a tiny percentage of what is actually going on when we meditate. So who are we to say what a bad meditation? Because we really can't perceive what actually is happening in meditation. The thoughts we're having are just on the surface of what we are experiencing. Just the surface. They mean nothing. Those thoughts mean nothing. They're just there because the brain needs to think. And so then if we accept that there is so much more going on, I mean, one, of course, proof is when we have a lot of things going on in our meditation with the brain, and we're sitting there, we're meditating, we're putting our time in, and we feel better the rest of the day. That, to me, is the most empirical evidence that more is going on. Because if we just judge the meditation by those busy thoughts and define our meditation by whether I have busy thoughts or not, then we've failed. But if we define our meditation in a different way, that more is going on than I'm aware, and I did the best I could, and yes, the thoughts were crazy, and over time, the thoughts get calmer and calmer. I always look at whether my thoughts are busy in a meditation means that my heart has more excited emotions in it and is not being very calm. Because the calmer the heart is, the calmer the thoughts are. Or the calmer the thoughts are, the calmer the heart becomes. And so in meditation, it's such a beautiful opportunity to tune into the more subtle, or begin to tune into the more subtle, to be open to the more subtle that is actually going on. And it's such a beautiful mystery. It's such a beautiful mystery to unfold, a beautiful mystery to find out about. That is what going deeper in meditation is. It's unfolding that mystery of the divine within, of perceiving more subtle realities within. That's the unfolding of the mystery. That's what we mean by being able to go into deeper meditation. It's not just that we sat still like a rock and the thoughts weren't there. It's that we were able to perceive more and more deeply what is actually going on inside. Master said when we're meditating, he was relating it to Kriya Yoga, but I'm sure it's true of Hong Sa, that when we meditate, we're opening up subtle channels inside. Who feels those channels? Who even knows they exist? Until Master wrote that, I don't know. Maybe I read some esoteric book that said there are subtle channels in the astral spine, but I think I learned that first from Master. There are subtle channels in the astral spine that open up at certain points. First of all, Kriya takes the energy that's going up and down in the Sushumna, in the Irda and Pingala, and brings it up into the Sushumna, which goes from doing a dualistic act to a non-dualistic act, which then means no karma is created, or at least no negative karma. Anyway, so these subtle things, can we feel the energy when it's only going up the Sushumna versus when it's in the Irda and Pingala? Over time you can, because you feel a higher state of consciousness in a certain way. But then there are even more subtle channels that can we perceive those things? Does it matter if we perceive those things? Well, maybe not the subtle channels, but Master even said that in order to open up the seventh chakra, on this path, we focus on, we sort of say the medulla is the sixth chakra, and the agya is the positive polarity of the sixth chakra. And we rarely talk about the sahasrara because Master said that you have to reach a certain stage of enlightenment for the subtle channels to open that help us get to the seventh chakra. So we don't focus here, we focus here so that more and more energy fills the brain with light, and sooner or later that subtle channel will open up as we put our time in, as we begin, love God more and more, those types of things. That's probably a million different subtle channels that are related to that. And so then there's all these other subtle channels that we're opening up. We don't know them. We can't perceive them. But what can we perceive? And that's where we should start. We start with what we can perceive and go from there. We don't fight against, I wish I could feel more, I wish I could have a big experience of God, then I would know He's with me. God is like a whisper. When the heart is calm, and we can have that intuitive perception of the presence of God, sometimes it's as though He walked past us and we feel a wind of His presence. And if we're lucky, we perceive that wind and go, was that you, God? And then He comes and says, yes. Comes as peace, comes as joy, comes as love. But we have to have that perception and that desire to perceive. And that takes quietness. That takes the willingness to quiet ourselves. That means even before meditation, we begin a practice of preparing for meditation, preparing a place to meditate, preparing a quiet space. We can't just go from outward rajasic energy and then just suddenly say, okay, now I'm meditating. There needs to be a transition. And we need to be willing to do that transition. Take the time for that transition. Even if it's only 5 minutes of that transition, it starts with, okay, and now I'm about to meditate. And we get rid of the people around us, and we go to the room, and we light the candle, and we offer up a prayer, and we have a blanket of silence around us. And that silence is one of the things that really helps the heart become calm and able to perceive what is going on in terms of God's presence. So then there are other things we can do to calm the heart, things we can do in everyday life. One of the things I've been kind of talking about lately is if we can learn to resist impulsive urges or impulsive acts, then there's a certain calmness that can be developed in the heart. And for instance, yesterday I was talking to a level 4 class about this, so please forgive me, level 4 students, if you're in the class. But just a really good example, a really good modern day example is if we're writing an email and someone has bothered us and we've decided to write that email and we press send, and then who knows what kind of a mess we've gotten ourselves into that we have to then apologize or be self-righteous about or whatever it is. That's an impulsive act to press that send button with a feeling of anger, agitation. And if we just take a moment to feel the heart, does my heart feel agitated right now as I'm about to press send? And if it does, don't press send. In fact, things can wait. If someone bothers us, is insulting, agitates us, things can wait. We don't have to immediately confront or immediately even suffer around it. Instead, we can pull into the spine. We can meditate and say, well, something's going on with them. It has, nothing to do with me, unless, I caused it or something. But they may attack us, and in our silence, without interacting, without responding harshly back, they may realize in themselves that they have done something inappropriate or wrong. And we didn't have to even do anything for them to have that realization. They just feel suddenly guilty. They may even come, if they have a little humility, and apologize for what they just did. You see how, and then what happens? Our heart feels calm. We didn't have to disturb that calmness by pressing the send button. That calmness was able to remain undisturbed. And so it's very important to start learning how to live without this impulsive action. I'm not talking about a call to action where there's an emergency and we have to act right away. But in times when we just feel impulsive about things, when we want to hit back or talk back to people, or even in the car, anger at someone or something, we want to develop the habit of, rather than lashing out, that we instead go in the spine. And we'll find that we cultivate more and more inner peace, but most of all, more and more calmness in the heart. Calmness, the quality of calmness, is a very deep quality that requires, I think, years of meditation. But we want to be aware that that's one of the goals, is to get this calmness. This calmness means the vrittis, not vrittis, in the heart. It's the vrittis in the heart. Okay, sorry. The vrittis in the heart are more calm. That the waves of feeling have become more calm. And that doesn't make us zombies or uncaring or aloof in any way. Rather, it just allows us to perceive the truth. And the more we practice that in our everyday life, the more we're going to be able to perceive the truth inside. And vice versa. The more we are quiet and perceiving the truth inside, the more we're going to be able to be quiet and perceive the truth out there. So over time, we learn to tune into God on a more and more subtle way. It starts with that wind of God passing by, and we say, I see you. And God says, I see you too. And we say, I love you. And he says, I love you too. And then suddenly we have a heart full of peace, a heart full of joy. But in the beginning, it comes and goes. In the beginning, we often, in the early meditation classes, people will say, how can I remember God more? And one solution is set that timer on your phone once an hour to have it go off. And when the alarm goes off, train yourself to say, that means it's time for me to perceive God. It's time for me to say a prayer or tune in one way or another. Well, once an hour is really not enough, but it's a start. We start where we are. And so the more we can bring God into everything, the more we are able to fill our lives with that joy, fill our lives with that peace, and be able to perceive the unseen. Then we feel bliss periodically. Then we feel joy more often in the meditation and out of the meditation. Then we feel our hearts filled with love for God more and more, until finally that presence is always there, and it feels abnormal to not have it there. So we train ourselves in meditation, in our life for God, to more and more have His presence be perceived constantly. And it doesn't get in the way of work. We're always having an inner conversation of one thing or another, aren't we? We're talking to someone and thinking about our bills. There's always two conversations at least going on. If there's an outer one, there's usually an inner one. What am I going to say next? All these things. But what if instead, when someone's talking to us, we listen with our whole self present, but we're also asking God to bless them, bless the situation, feel His presence in that situation. Just more and more, the more we meditate, the more we are calm, the more we are willing to soothe and resist impulsive actions, the more peace we're going to have in our lives, and then the more we'll be able to perceive someday even those subtle channels that we're opening. Someday we'll be able to feel what Master says we're actually doing. And it doesn't have to be some big, giant spiritual experience. Sometimes people say, no, God hasn't been present with me yet. No, I don't feel Him at all, because they're expecting it to be a certain way. They're expecting it to be a large thing happening, a big vision or a big piece of bliss that overtakes me, and I kind of half pass out. That they talk about this a lot with us, but in reality, there is infinite joy when we feel God's love. There's an ability to feel infinite joy when we feel God's love. Master said, God is ever new joy, ever new love. And so we can tune into that. It's not about big outward. It's about subtle inward. And so anyway, I hope we can all strive to just become more and more quiet in that way, or willing to be quiet, and also willing to be in contact with God more and more often. And just as Swamiji said, I'll read it to end it. A willingness to seek the underlying reality behind appearances is essential for those who would know God. Thank you, everyone.